Welcome to week 13. We're getting close to the end. I feel it too. So last week we talked about injury. Injury is a certainty in sport, and it has some major psychological implications. We looked at some of the ways in which emotional distress results from injury, as well as the stress model of injury. And I actually had no idea that a relationship between stress and injury existed before I found that Anderson and Williams article. And I thought that article was so interesting, and it really presented a very strong and straightforward relationship between stress and injury, which I think that's useful information for all of us as athletes, coaches, personnel. Whether we're the athlete or whether we're working with other athletes. I thought that was a really interesting relationship and a really great study. So this week, we're looking at the concept of addiction as it relates to exercise and sport. So addiction in the case of exercise and sport really isn't a black and white issue. It's hard to decide, especially by looks, when addiction exists and when it doesn't exist. So I used to work at a rec center up at the U of A. I worked in the campus rec department in the Hyper building. And every once in a while, we would have a student come in who, by appearance, looked like they had an exercise addiction. They were in the fitness center for several hours a day. And so we wondered what to do, and a lot of intramural and campus recreation departments have since come up with protocol to address when they suspect an individual that has an exercise addiction in their facility. So that's an interesting responsibility that sports professionals might have if you run a weight room or an exercise facility. How do you approach someone who you suspect might have an exercise addiction? That's just an interesting kind of current issue that pops up sometimes. So, like I said, in sports and exercise, addiction isn't a black and white issue. There are various phases of participation that fall along a continuum of degree of addiction. And addiction to one person may not be addiction to another person. It's a lot of it. There is a physical element, certainly, but there is also a psychological element. And there are also positive aspects and negative aspects of addiction. And, addiction in this case isn't all negative like it is with things like drugs or gambling or something like that. So we're going to look at some of those ideas this week when we talk about addiction and sport and exercise. We have a discussion questions this week, and then next week is your last quiz and your sports psychologist assignment. So I want to remind you of a couple of things in the sports psychologist assignment, just some quick tips. Please compose your questions, your interview questions, in interview format. So it should be like you're having a verbal interview with somebody. Sometimes I get papers that have the questions in questionnaire format. For example, questions that are multiple choice or yes-no answers that somebody would circle. That's not what an interview is. That's not an interview, that's a questionnaire. So keep your questions like a verbal back and forth interview style. Also be specific in tying your analysis back to some of the psychological concepts and theories that we have looked at in class. For example, maybe you want to talk about internal versus external motivation from week 11, or maybe the flow state that was also in week 11. Or maybe you can relate back to the big 5 personality traits that we looked at in week 10, particularly hardiness. Or maybe you want to see or analyze how optimized their anxiety levels are. And we're going to talk about that in next week's content. We're going to talk about the right level of anxiety. Too little isn't enough and too much is stressful. So maybe you want to look at that in next week's content. So just wanted to give you some ideas for some things to tie back your psychological analysis to, but certainly don't limit yourself to those. I just wanted to remind you to be specific in your tie-in to the class material, to some specific theories we looked at. So please feel free to ask me questions as always. And I hope you've enjoyed some of the sports psych stuff that we're looking at. That's really one of my favorite topics in sports in general, just because I feel like we can relate to so many of them, and the tie between the physical and the psychological can be so interesting at times. Just the way that those two aspects of the human body interact with each other. So anyway, I like sports psych. So have a good week, and we're getting close to the end. I hope you're doing well, and I'll talk to you soon.